Hello, my name's Alan Williams, and today I'm representing Global Values Alliance, World Values Day and UK Values Alliance to celebrate 2019's theme of values and well-being. And I'm delighted to have with us Professor Kasser from Knox College in the US. We're going to have a conversation about the relationship between values and well-being today in honor of this year's World Values Day. So welcome, Professor Kasser.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It's great that you've spent time. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. So I'm a professor of psychology at a small liberal arts college called Knox College in Illinois. I've been here for 24 years. Actually, I'm retiring from here in about a month and a half. I've been researching people's values and goals and their relationship to various forms of well-being for over 30 years, since the time I was in graduate school at the University of Rochester back in the mid-1980s. I've written 5 books and lots of research articles and things like that on this and other topics. I've also done a lot of consulting over the years with activist organizations and non-governmental organizations, especially in the UK, but all over the world too.
Great. So I'm just sitting here thinking, wow, that's a lifetime's work, right?
Why I'm retiring.
So could I ask what has drawn you to it? What drew it to you in the first place and what kept you there?
Mm-hmm. Well, really, values was what drew me in the first place to this kind of work. I was interested, I came from kind of an existential and humanistic tradition, which is very interested in how people grow, how people are either authentic in who they really are or alienated and separate from who they are. And how they try to construct their lives, because the existentialists and the humanists believe that there is at least the possibility of human freedom, even if we aren't always free. And so one of the ways that I started thinking about it back in my 20s was that one of the ways, at least, that we try to construct our lives is through the things that our goals, through our aspirations, and through our values. Our values are those things which we view as being important. They're, our conceptions of the ideal is how they're oftentimes defined in psychology. There are idea about what an ideal world is, or about what our ideal life is like, or what our ideal partner is like, or our ideal job is like. And so when we have these values in our minds, they can motivate us. They can help us decide that, okay, well, I'm going to pursue this path, not that path, because this path is important to me and reflects what's important to me and what I value. This path, not so much. So that was really the entree point for me when I first began this work, was trying to understand how people's values and goals end up influencing and directing their lives. And very soon after that is when I started getting interested in well-being, because well-being was a really good outcome as a psychologist to use, to be thinking about, the question of, well, which sets of values are that people view are important actually help them to grow, actually help them to be well, actually help them to live authentic lives, and which values and goals are ones which actually interfere with that. And at that point in the 1980s, really, but nobody was asking that question about values. People had been asking questions about values, but not how values related to well-being, and certainly not how the content of people's values related to well-being. And so very early on, I kind of stumbled on the finding that people who said that one of the things they valued was making a lot of money and having a lot of possessions, that those people actually reported relatively low levels of well-being compared to people who had other sorts of values that they prioritized. And that became the basis for a lot of my early work, and ended up kind of spinning into why I ended up writing books about consumer culture and materialism and capitalism, and eventually also into getting interested in topics beyond personal well-being, also things like social well-being and ecological well-being.
Okay. So from what you've said, is it about something more explicit than living your values? What you're saying is that it's living particular values that lead you to a greater sense of well-being.
Yes, absolutely. And that's exactly what our work shows. You know, before the work that my colleagues and I did, it was just that idea that if you have values and if you live those values and if you succeed at those values, then you're going to be happy. And we came in with a critique of that idea and said, no, that's not the case. It depends upon the content of the values that you pursue. And so very early on in 1995 or 6, we made a distinction between what we called intrinsic values and extrinsic values. So intrinsic values are values like your own personal growth or having good relationships with family and friends or contributing to the community. And we call those intrinsic values because from our theoretical perspective, they are intrinsically satisfying to pursue. You're doing them because they matter in and of themselves, and because they meet intrinsic psychological needs that all people have from our theoretical perspective. So just like a plant needs a certain amount of water and sunlight, people have psychological needs too that have to be fulfilled for people to thrive. Extrinsic goals and values, on the other hand, are values which are focused on rewards and praise. And the three main extrinsic goals we've studied have been for money, for image, and for status. And those are all extrinsic in the sense, as you can see, they involve getting some external reward or praise, but they're also pursued as a means to some other end. So why do people want money? Well, the money in and of itself doesn't do anything. It's good for some other reason, right? So after establishing this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic goals, what we found in our research and what has been replicated dozens of times in lots and lots of different nations since then is that the more that people prioritize intrinsic goals relative to extrinsic goals, the higher their personal well-being, the more they treat other people in ways which will facilitate other people's well-being, and the more they behave in ways which facilitate the Earth's well-being.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when people focus on those extrinsic goals for money, image, and status, what the research shows is that they have lower personal well-being, they treat other people in more manipulative, less empathic ways, and they behave in ways which are more damaging to the environment. So, and that's been replicated for things like how important are these goals to us. We also find that attainment of those intrinsic goals provides greater well-being than attaining the extrinsic goals. So if you get your intrinsic goals, that actually improves your well-being. If you get your extrinsic goals, there's probably like a little short, oh great, I got this new car kind of feeling, right? But in terms of really being nutritive and supportive of people's well-being, it actually is not helpful for well-being. We found it for things like how much effort people spend on their goals. So the more effort you put into your intrinsic goals, the more your life is going to be oriented around those goals, and the research shows the happier you're going to be. The more effort you're putting into those extrinsic goals, actually your well-being is lower. So that actually those findings stand in contrast with a lot of psychological perspectives, which would suggest, no, whatever goal is fine. And clearly they stand in real opposition to the messages that consumer capitalism tells us 3,000 times a day through advertisements and other means.
Okay, so I understand the point about the relativity here. So satisfying your intrinsic needs, you achieve a greater sense of well-being than for your extrinsic needs.
Well, we wouldn't say extrinsic needs, to be clear. So we would when we're talking about intrinsic, extrinsic, we're talking about values, okay? So what the intrinsic values do is they satisfy people's needs. What the research shows is that the extrinsic values end up frustrating people's needs, and that's part of why their well-being is lower.
Okay. And so it's a bit like, to translate that into practical terms, I've a friend who bought himself a flash car, but then he started comparing himself against people that had cars that were even better.
Sure.
So he never actually got satisfied with the car that he had. And that's kind of what you're saying, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the three needs that we talk about are needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So autonomy is feeling like I'm choosing what I'm doing as opposed to being forced to do what I'm doing. Competence is feeling good at what I do. So I need to feel like a good psychologist because that's where my identity is. I don't need to feel like I'm a good basketball player, but I need to feel competent as a psychologist. And relatedness is the third need, which is the need to feel connected to others. What we find is that intrinsic values satisfy those needs well. Extrinsic values frustrate those needs. So in the case of your friend, he probably did at first feel like, hey, I've really made it. I bought this great car. But then as soon as he started comparing himself to other people, he didn't feel so competent anymore, right? And he probably also didn't feel very connected to those other people. So instead of feeling like love and empathy, he felt jealousy and envy. And that isn't a good basis for satisfying your relatedness needs.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's a great introduction into the whole topic of values. And I think that differentiation between the intrinsic and extrinsic is really helpful. So like I mentioned at the beginning, values and well-being is the topic of this year's World Values Day. Yeah. So could you please get us into what does well-being mean? Because that's another one of these phrases that's become very readily used.
Sure.
And perhaps with not much to thought behind it sometimes.
Yeah, well, I hope that there's a fair bit of thought behind it in psychology, at least. And, so the first thing I would say is until about 30 years ago, most psychologists did not study well-being. Okay, what they studied was ill-being. So they studied depression and anxiety and things like that. And then a variety of different things started to happen in the 80s and early 90s, including the rise of the positive psychology movement, which started to lead people to really focus on, well, what did it mean to be well? And there's been a lot of debate about that. And most of that debate has been around what does it mean to be, for an individual to have well-being. So one of the dominant ideas, I would say probably the dominant idea for a lot of the time, had to do with well-being was what was called subjective well-being. Okay, and this was proposed by a guy named Ed Diener. He's probably the most widely published and the expert in subjective well-being in the world. And he defined subjective well-being as involving three components. So you're satisfied with your life, you feel a lot of pleasant emotions like happiness and contentment and joy, and you don't feel many unpleasant emotions like anger and sadness and such like that. So those three things made up what Diener and many others have called well-being for a long time. It was this subjective sense that I'm satisfied, I'm happy, and I'm not unhappy, okay? Now, eventually, though, people started to say, well, there's more to well-being than that, too. That feels kind of superficial. And so a lot of people have started to say that that's what nowadays, a lot of people call that hedonic well-being, okay? So it's about pleasure, right? It's about this feeling of pleasure and not of psychological pain. And there's another kind of well-being that psychologists have started to study, and here they draw back all the way to Aristotle. And Aristotle had a term called eudaimonia, which is what he used to define well-being. And eudaimonia basically is about what I was talking about earlier. It's that sense of meaning in life. It's that sense of being true to your purpose in life. It's about a sense of having a higher purpose. So I can have hedonic well-being by eating a lot of chocolate cake and having a lot of sex, right? And having an easy job and enough money. But that doesn't mean I'm going to have a meaningful life, right? Okay. And so what Aristotle was talking about was that there's more than just that hedonism to it. There's this deeper meaning. And so nowadays in the personal well-being literature, these ideas of subjective well-being or hedonic well-being are complemented by eudaimonic well-being, this sense of purpose and meaning and vitality, and meaning doesn't always make us happy, so one of the things that people most frequently report makes them have a meaningful life is raising children. But if you've ever raised children, there's a lot of frustrations in that, right? Okay. And so But nonetheless, people do it and they find it very meaningful. And so we can see that there's these kind of two different aspects to well-being, right? Now, the other aspects of well-being that I've really argued for a lot over the last few years is that, okay, well, you could have somebody who's happy and you could have somebody who's living a meaningful life. But if they're living their life in a way which interferes with the ability of other people to have happy lives, which interferes with the ability of future generations to have happy, meaningful lives, and which interferes with the ability of other species to even survive, then I have real trouble calling that a good life, okay? I have trouble calling that well-being. And so one of the things that I and others as well have argued is that when we're talking about well-being, we need to talk about personal well-being, we need to talk about social well-being, civic well-being, if you will, and we need to talk about ecological well-being, the well-being of the planet, right? And so for me, and this is one of the things I found really fascinating about the intrinsic-extrinsic value distinction, is what we find is that the more that people focus on intrinsic values, they have happier personal lives. They treat others in ways which are more facilitative of those other people having happier lives. And they live in ways which are lighter on the planet. In contrast, when people focus on extrinsic values, they're less happy personally. They behave in more manipulative ways which undermine other people's well-being, and they behave in ways which destroy the planet. Yeah. So to me, well-being is all of those different things. And in one study you look at one, in another study you look at another. But that's the whole picture as I and I think others see it.
Okay. And what about the notion of physical well-being?
Mm-hmm.
How does that play?
Well, to me, physical well-being, I think, is another aspect of well-being. Thank you for raising that. And we have done a few studies where we found that intrinsic, extrinsic values are related to physical well-being. So people with more extrinsic values report more stomach aches and headaches and, kind of physical symptoms like that. They also engage in behaviors like smoking cigarettes and drinking alcohol more, which obviously have downstream effects on physical well-being, right? I guess I would probably set physical well-being as it's a kind of personal well-being, right? So it's a well-being of the organism, right? And so I guess maybe for me, when we're talking about personal well-being, we should probably talk about subjective hedonic well-being, eudaimonic well-being, and physical well-being. And all three of those would make up what a person's well-being would be.
Yeah, and then I liked your contrast that you've made again with the intrinsic and the extrinsic, because as you were talking about the person that is not necessarily encouraging well-being with others, just looking at the well-being of themselves, I thought of the local criminal, the drug dealer or whatever. Right. So they're having a very happy life themselves because they've got loads of money, and they're not having a very good impact at all on society. That's so exactly how can that be looked at in the same way as somebody who's leading a better life and more generally?
Yeah, well, and I would also note one of the interesting things we found is, and this has been shown in other research, so Sonia Lyubomirsky and others have found that when people are happy, they tend to act in more pro-social ways. And my colleagues and I have found, and this has been replicated multiple times, that people who are happier also live in more ecologically sustainable ways. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that, and part of what we've argued is that's because people who do all of those things are focused on intrinsic values, right? Intrinsic values conduce towards all of that, and therefore these different kinds of well-being tend to be positively associated with each other. Not perfectly positively associated, as in the case of the drug dealer and plenty of other folks, but generally positively associated with each other. So it's possible to live a happy, pro-social, sustainable life, which is good news, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not exactly a brilliant example, but you've reminded me of, we were on holiday in Sri Lanka, and we were staying in a bungalow on the beach, and there was another bungalow next to it, and a guy looked after both of these bungalows. And I was chatting to him. I don't know if you know, but in Sri Lanka, the climate is 6 months of brilliant sunshine and blue skies and 6 months of rain.
Okay.
And so one day I was talking to him, and I was saying, I can understand you're busy in the season when you're looking after your guests and all the rest of it. But what do you do in the season when it's pouring down with rain? And he looked me straight in the eye and just said, nothing. And he was very cool with that. It wasn't about, I'm not making any money and all the rest of it. It was just a real sense of, that's me, and that's fine.
Yeah.
And the other story he told me was about how he just had, I think it was like 2 pairs of flip-flops and 2 pairs of shorts and 4 t-shirts or whatever. Right. And he said, because, once you get more than that, you then need a washing machine. And if that breaks down, you've got a problem. And he was really centered and very clear about the way that he wanted to lead his life, which I've remembered it for many years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a guy who's really chosen his life, right? Yeah. And who's, and I don't know much about Sri Lankan culture, but I do know that it has a substantial Buddhist population to it, right? And it sounds pretty Buddhist the way he's approaching things. Yeah. As opposed to life in the UK and US and plenty of other Western places where we're busy all the time. And if we're not busy, we feel like we're not doing something. And again, where we're being told that, how could you even think about not working 6 months out of the year? And how could you only have 2 pair of shoes or whatever? You need, right? And so this is part of what, and the research shows this is part of what pushes people away from those intrinsic values and towards the extrinsic values. Whereas this guy sounds like he's been able to keep himself centered on what's really important.
Yeah, and in the work that I do, I refer to that as the first situation is kind of reacting to the busyness around us. Mm. And the alternative is to make conscious choices about the way you're going to behave.
Sure.
And it's so different, those 2 routes that you can take.
Yeah.
What about the connection between the 2 then? Because in our work in UK Values Alliance and Global Values Alliance, we've tended to focus on values themselves. But this year, when we were thinking about the theme for World Values Day in 2019, we thought, well, actually, the reason why it's so important to focus on values is because you will improve the chances of a better well-being. So could you please just describe the connection between the 2?
I'm sorry, just to be clear, the values and the well-being?
Yes. How do the 2 relate to each other?
Well, again, what I would say, like I did before, values in and of themselves generally do not relate to well-being, except for to say this. It's better to have things that you think are important than to have nothing you think of as important. Okay. So, and that's a fairly standard finding. So if you kind of think of like the totally disengaged 21-year-old who doesn't care about anything at all, that's not a good outcome for people. Okay. To care about nothing. That's clear. Okay. That said, what our research and other research has shown is that if you're interested in facilitating personal, social, and ecological well-being, it's important to not just say, well, it's, care about values. What you instead need to do is to care about particular kinds of values, okay? In our case, we talk about them, the intrinsic values and not the extrinsic values. Now, why? Well, what we know from the research is that when people focus, and the data show this, by the way, okay, there have been studies using what's called structural equation modeling, which demonstrate this, that when people say what's important to them is intrinsic values for personal growth and affiliation and community, what happens is that they live their lives around those values, right? Then they report that their needs are better satisfied. And when they report that their needs are better satisfied, they report that their life is happier and they're experiencing more positive emotions, less depression, anxiety, etc. So what happens is that by living your life around those intrinsic values, what are you spending your time doing? Well, if you care about personal growth, you're spending your time doing things like art or exploring consciousness or, having new experiences. If you care about affiliation, you're spending time with your friends and your family. And if you care about community, you're spending your time volunteering and doing activist work, right? Those activities, the research shows, end up satisfying people's needs. They're things people choose to do. They're things people find fun. They're things people find that they're not doing because they have to do them, but because they want to do them. They feel competent at those things, and they feel connected with other people. And as a result, they end up experiencing higher levels of well-being, personal well-being. In contrast, think about a person who cares about extrinsic values. Well, they need to make a heck of a lot of money, so they work a lot of hours. They go into debt in order to buy the things they want, but they can't afford. They're very focused on their image, so they always have to be paying attention to what's new and what's not new, so they can have the new things, so people will then tell them that how cool they are. But then the people don't always tell them how cool they are, so they're not always feeling really great about that. And they want to have status, but there's always somebody who has higher status, and not everybody thinks they're all that cool, right? So the day-to-day experience of the person who focuses on those extrinsic values, in contrast to the intrinsic values, the extrinsically oriented people are having momentary experiences which do a bad job of facilitating those needs, right? Okay, of satisfying those needs, and therefore they feel lower well-being. Okay, so that's how it works for personal well-being, and that's what the research shows. Now, in terms of the other kinds of well-being, again, what you have to think about, well, what are values? Values are conceptions of the ideal that tell us what's important, okay? Another great synonym for values is what are called guiding principles, okay? So they're principles we have in our mind that guide us as to how to behave, okay? So if I care a lot about, again, let's say money, status, and power, and image, well, that idea of what's important is going to lead me to try to lord it over other people in my interactions with other people, because I want to show how much I've made it and how much money I've got, right? That's not going to work very well for other people's well-being, okay? It's also going to lead me, and the research shows this, to objectify other people, to turn other people into objects for me to manipulate in order for me to get ahead. Okay, think Machiavelli's The Prince, right? Okay, it's also going to lead me to want to buy a big car or a flashy car without caring about what its gas mileage and emissions are. It's going to lead me to fly a lot. It's going to lead me to have a big, expensive house, all of which is bad for the environment. Okay, so our values, our conceptions of the idea, end up influencing our attitudes and our behaviors, which then end up influencing personal and social well-being. In contrast, if I care about intrinsic values, well, if what I'm interested in is, helping other people, my community feeling values, well, then that's going to lead me to go behave in ways which help other people, right? It's going to lead me to think about things like future generations and other species, and maybe shop differently, maybe invest differently, maybe decide to have a job which is good for the planet and good for other people instead of good for just how much money I make, okay? And so it ends up influencing the behavior. Right. So really the idea here is that values, these conceptions of the ideas, of the ideal, these guiding principles, end up influencing our behavior and our attitudes. And that ends up influencing the way we treat other people on the planet. It also ends up influencing our moment-to-moment experience of need satisfaction, which influences our personal well-being. So that's how it all fits together.
It's when you describe it like that, Tim, it seems like a no-brainer and remarkably simple.
That's what I love about it, actually, is that it really, when I talk about these things, I've been talking about this stuff for a long time, and when I talk about it, people recognize it, they get it, right? You know, they hear these ideas and they say, yeah, that fits with what I already knew. I didn't have the terminology, I didn't have the 500 studies behind it or all that sort of stuff. But it makes sense because, you know, people have been saying this for thousands of years. You go back to Lao Tzu, you go back to Buddha, you go to Jesus, you go to Socrates. Pretty much any philosopher or theologian or religious leader, spiritual leader has said something like this. Focus your life around your personal growth and your relationships and helping others. Don't care about money, status, and power, right? You can find that all over the Bible. You can find that all over the I Ching. You can find that all over, the Tao Te Ching. You can find that all over Buddhist texts, okay? You know, and Islam, Judaism, you name it, it's there, okay? And so I think this is a set of ideas which resounds with people and which does seem right because it is right. It's been said for a long time. I think what's different in our case is we've got the data, okay? We've got scientific data in order to lend credence to this philosophical and spiritual wisdom.
So the well-being agenda has exploded in the last probably 4 years, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were thinking about this year's theme for World Values Day of Values and Wellbeing, it kind of occurred to us that values could, perhaps should, be a much more significant part of the well-being agenda, and yet it doesn't seem to be.
Yeah.
So do you feel the same way about that? And if so, why do you think that's the case?
I do feel the same way about that. And the reason I feel that's the case is because, so to be clear, I by no means am trying to say that all of what explains why people feel happy or not is due to values. That's not my claim. I'm just trying to say that values are relevant, okay? There are other relevant factors too. Those other relevant factors, some of those other relevant factors, however, are much easier to and much more consistent with the dominant political social economic narrative than is the tale I just spun you. The tale I just spun you, from my perspective, makes one have to deeply wonder whether consumer capitalism is a viable way to actually promote all of the forms of well-being that I just described. Because consumer capitalism is based in extrinsic values. It's based in getting people to work a lot of hours, go into a lot of debt, buy a lot of stuff, economic growth, the development of natural land into a resource that can be used for somebody to make money off of it, competition, winners and losers, all of that stuff is extrinsic values, right? Advertising people try to sell us that stuff as though it'll help our personal growth or in our friendships and such, okay? But the data just don't bear that out. If you dig deeply into what it means to organize an agenda around values, and you buy the narrative that I just spun, which, to use a capitalist or advertising metaphor there, then that is a direct challenge to the dominant political, economic, social system. And one that calls for a deep rethinking that almost nobody is willing to undertake. And almost nobody in power is willing to undertake. Why? Because it's not good for business as we can currently conceive of business, and it's not good politically because most politicians, especially in the United States, are in the pocket of big business, whether they're Democrat or Republican. It's all the same. It's all the same. Okay. I think it's less of a problem in the UK, given the way that campaigns are financed in the UK, but it's still a pretty big problem from everything that I've been able to see about UK politics, and I'm sure that's true in other places as well. So you're talking about a fundamental rethink here, okay, of the way that the world is organized. In contrast, saying, oh, you're unhappy? Well, take this selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that's actually completely consistent with the current narrative,
Yeah.
okay, and makes a heck of a lot of money for a lot of big pharmaceutical companies and psychiatrists. Or, well, you want to be happy, do some mindfulness meditation. Well, mindfulness meditation is great. I meditate, okay, and we know actually that more mindful people care more about intrinsic values and less about extrinsic values, okay? But to get people to sit for 20 minutes and pay attention to their breath is not actually especially as it has been used by corporations in the US, actually has been swung and framed as ways which can facilitate effectiveness and productivity, right? Okay, yeah. That's what it's about, right? So what, and this is true of any system, what I'm about to say, any system wants to maintain itself, okay? Whether it's your personality or a religion or a political system. And it sets up things which make it easy to maintain itself, and it makes it difficult for people to do things which are a challenge to it. That's why if you're Christian and you do bad things, you're going to go to hell, right? That's the punishment that it says. This sort of values approach is you're going to go to hell for a capitalist, okay? You know, well, then the economy's going to collapse and nobody will have jobs. And then the environment will be worse then, right? You know, these are the kinds of things you hear, right? Okay, and so that's my analysis of why it is that it's difficult to get, and I've been doing this for a long time, and I've had these conversations and I've felt these frustrations in my activist work as well. You know, people like the ideas only so far, right? And once they start to see what the real implications of these ideas are, then it becomes scarier, and then it becomes more difficult to get people to do what it takes to make changes. I have a more hopeful thing I'll say in a second, but that's my answer to your question.
Okay, and I'm just curious whether you think there might also be a connection with the way that psychology has developed, because yeah. In the early days it was all about putting bad people or ill people right, and then the positive psychology movement came about, and they said, well, no, it doesn't have to be about that. This can be making people good. You don't have to address a problem in the first place. So is there a parallel there, perhaps, in some way?
Well, I think so, but I also think, as we discussed earlier, most of positive psychology has been about trying to make people happy. It has not paid attention to these other issues of trying to help people's social and ecological behavior. It has a little bit more recently, okay? But generally, its initial incarnation was not focused on that, okay? And so I do think that psychology plays into this. And, you know, you also look into its history, you know, with regard to behaviorism and such like that, focus on rewards, trying to manipulate people so that they do the thing the authority figure wants, okay? You know, psychology has played a big role in helping to shape the way that the workforce is organized under capitalism, the way that education is organized under capitalism, which is to turn out people who will eventually be good little workers, okay, et cetera. So yeah, no doubt that and there are thousands upon thousands of people with psychology degrees and anthropology degrees who work in the advertising industry in order to figure out the best ways to manipulate us to want more stuff.
There's no hope for us, Tim.
Well, that I don't agree with, but I do think that, but this is part of, it is part of the unfortunate legacy of my discipline.
Well, it's and that's with World Values Day. What we're looking to do here is equip people with the possibility to explore their values, and in a practical way, so that they get some sense of the experience of how their well-being might be improved in an instant. You know, just a small experience of that. And our best hope then is that people will want to make that a bigger part of their lives. So
Sure.
one of the core activities for this year is to take a values break. And so what we're encouraging people to do is just pause. You can have a cup of tea in the UK, or you can have a soft drink somewhere else, and just reflect on what intrinsic values are important to you. Identify one, so choose one, and then make a decision about an action that you're going to take in honor of that. So I'm not sure if you would use this terminology, but let me use the example of, if you identified compassion as something that you wanted to practice, you might say, because compassion, it's a very conceptual notion, as you were referring to earlier. So you might say to yourself, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer help to a stranger. That's what I'm going to do, which will bring to life my value of compassion.
Yep.
So if you make a decision to do that and it's front of mind, when the opportunities for you to practice come about, you're much more likely to see them. And because it's in your front of mind, you're much more likely to dive in.
Yep.
So imagine that you're walking down the street and you see an old lady with a heavy bag. Because you've decided that you're going to practice offering help, you're much more likely to go over and say, can I help you across the road with that?
Yep.
Then hopefully you'll get a good experience. She won't barge you out of the way and say, leave me alone, I can manage, thank you very much.
Sure.
And you'll be rewarded for your action. And so it will then encourage you to practice it again.
Yes.
And then our best hope, as I was saying, is that once people realize the impact that that creates, not only on themselves, but in that example, the old lady being very grateful as well, and telling other people, and the ripple effect that that has, then perhaps people will be more encouraged to try it again.
Yeah.
And in that way, slowly take control of their lives rather than be led by the environment that's around them. So we've got great hopes for the Take a Values Break campaign this year.
It's wonderful. I'm sorry, was there more you were going to say?
No, I was just going to thank you so much for providing the insight into the topic of values, the topic of well-being, the relationship between the two, and the explanation of why values is not more dominant in the space of well-being when it could be, and it could bring so much if it was.
Yeah, you're welcome. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk with you about this. It's been great, and I hope everybody has a great World Values Day.
Thanks very much.
You bet.